event that are narrated in our Sedra VaEra, and I've chosen some really fascinating, I think, fascinating selections from haTurim to analyze and to discuss tonight. So let's start at the beginning. We're in Parashas VaEra. We can find it in the art scroll on page 318, and it is the near the beginning of chapter 6. Actually, it's interesting. This is one of those cases where the chapter divisions do not align perfectly with our tradition and with especially the division into sedras, in which the sedra frequently begins with the first pasuk in a chapter, because the chapters, as we mentioned in the past, were actually chosen by non-Jewish, not so much the printers. The printers popularized it, but it was selected and like divided up in a particular way by Christian scholars, and we have adapted it just because of the convenience of it. But as we can see here, this Sedra VaEra actually begins with a pasuk base, verse 2 in chapter 6. Okay, page 318, if you're with me in the Art Scroll VaEra, Elohim el Moshe V'emer elav ani Adonai. So God introduces himself to Moshe, and he says, Ani Hashem. And the next pasuk elaborates a bit further on some of the possible names of God. VaEra el Avraham el Yitzchak vel Yaakov el Shaddai. I appeared to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov with a different name. I appeared to them with the name of El Shaddai. This is one of the holy names of Hashem. Ushmi Hashem lo nodai to them, but my name of Yud Kei Vav Kei I did not reveal to them. Much has been written about this because we do find that name in the description of the revelation of Hashem to the patriarchs. Probably the meaning is that the name of Hashem, which is the Tetragrammaton, which suggests a uniformity, a unity, a harmony. That name is derived from Haya Hoveh V'hi, a God who is eternal, who transcends time, suggesting that there's a kind of harmony and a perfection in God's ways. The problem is that our perception doesn't always conform to that ideal of the uniformity of God's ways. We sometimes experience Hashem's ways as baffling, as even paradoxical or contradictory. So that's Shmi Hashem. That is the name that connotes the ultimate understanding of the unity. But that takes us down a philosophical route, which is not my intention to pursue tonight. Just wanted to translate the words in a way that at the simple pshat level sheds light on the simple meaning. What I want to explore, though, is what haTurim says about the words VaEra el Avram el Yitzchak el Yaakov. I appeared to the patriarchs. And here they're not just mentioned collectively, but they're mentioned individually, because Hashem could have said VaEra el HaAvos. He says clearly the names Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So haTurim says an interesting thing. It says, I think it's an elegant remez. The Sofei Tevos, excuse me, the last letters of the names Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Avraham. So if we consider the last letter in those three names, working backwards from Yaakov, then Yitzchak, then Avraham, we have Beis Kuf Mem. Beis Kuf Mem doesn't have that much meaning unto itself, but if we apply the simple Atbash code, Atbash is one of the ways of finding a remez, a hint in the meaning of the words of the Torah. It's used for gematria purposes in the sense that Aleph is replaced with Taf, Base is replaced with Shin. It's Atbash Gardak, in which each of the first 11 letters of the alphabet correspond to the 11 letters from the end of the alphabet, starting with the last. So the first letter is transposed with the last letter. The second letter, Base, is transformed with the second from last letter, Shin. That's called Atbash. So we use it for gematria, but here it's used not so much for gematria, but actually for the letters themselves. Base, Kuf, Mem, the Sofei Tevos of Yaakov, Yitzchak, Avraham, are in Atbash Shin Daled Yud. because you can work it out easily enough. Shin Daled Yud correspond to the letters Beis Kuf Mem. So in Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or if you like, in the opposite order, we have the name of Hashem Shaddai, which means God who is almighty, who is all powerful. So that's the remez in the statement that my name, Hashem says to Moshe, of Shaddai, Shin Daled Yud, is associated with the Avos. Then he says that if you look at the Rosh Tevos, at the first letters of those three names, Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, there you can change the order. It doesn't matter whichever order you want to use, because the gematria will still be the same. So it's Aleph for Abraham, Yud and Yud for Yitzhak, Yaakov. So it's 21. Of course, Yud is 10, Aleph is 1. So 10 plus 1 is 21. You hopefully remember from our shir, I think 2 weeks ago, that the name of God of Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be, who I will be, that name has a gematria of 21. And haTurim explained a few deeper insights into that as well, but that's not for now. So for now, we will consider that Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov have the gematria of the same gematria. The Rosh Tevos, Avraham, Yaakov have the gematria of Ehyeh, which is gematria of 21. So he adds on in a very, I think, literary flourish, V'zeh malach Hashem saviv li re'av. The pasuk in Tehillim says that the angel of God dwells around, encompasses, surrounds his those who fear him. So Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, those three names are in a derech remez, surrounded by the names of God, because the last letters of those names in Atbash is Shin Daled Yud, and the first letter of those three names, the first letters of those three names is Gematria 21, which alludes to the name of Hashem of Ehyeh. So this is Chonem Alach Hashem Saviv Li Re'av. What we see here, of course, is that the Baal haTurim has discovered a remez, like a glimpse of the deeper meaning, which is hinted to in the words and the names of the patriarchs themselves. Aside from what the Torah actually tells us about them, here we have a remez, how the names of God are hinted to in the names of Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. Very famous is the pasuk Vav. Take a look at pasuk Vav, and here we have Hashem says to Moshe. At the end of last week's Parasha, Moshe was very distressed because his efforts to persuade or maybe intimidate or instruct, or even if you want to say to plead with Paro to release the Jewish people, had backfired entirely. He threw Moshe and Aaron out of the palace. He said, I don't know this God of Israel, I never heard of him. I'm not going to listen to him. I'm not going to send the people. And if they have time to be imagining or planning or contemplating going to serve God in the wilderness, they're not working hard enough. I'll ensure they work much harder. And it ended on a very dire note, last week's Parsha, and Moshe even went back to God and said, this mission has been a disaster. So Hashem is, so to speak, now responding to Moshe's challenge, and he's reassuring him that the redemption, or at least the beginning of the redemption, is now at hand. And he says in Pasuk Vav, verse 6, Lachein emor livnei Yisrael, ani Hashem, say to the children of Israel, I am God. And this is the famous part, those four verbs, four expressions of redemption. Arba, Lishonos Shel, Geula. V'hotzesi eschem mitachas sivlos Mitzrayim is the first one. V'hitzalti eschem avodasam. V'hitzalti is to save is the second one. V'ge'alti eschem b'zoran, I will redeem them with an outstretched arm. V'shvatim godim v'lakachti eschem lilam. At the beginning of the next pasuk, v'lakachti eschem lilam, and I will take them, and I will take v'lakachti eschem, I will take you to me as a nation, and I will be a God to you, etc. Those are the four expressions of redemption. That's a bit later, which maybe hints to the final, the fifth redemption, the fifth expression of redemption. But the Talmud identifies four. The Talmud accepts that there are four expressions of redemption. Much has been written about this. You probably know that the four cups of wine at the Seder, among other things, are seen as corresponding to these four expressions of redemption, four levels of redemption. As I say, much has been written about it. haTurim has a simple suggestion here, which is at the same time I feel is profound. The four expressions, I'll just say them again: V'hotseisi, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. So he says these are the famous four expressions of redemption corresponding to the four Malchuyos, the four empires who have dominated the Jewish people, who have, so to speak, uh, exercised authority over the Jewish world or the Jews who are dispersed within the various exiles. And of course, it is the last of these, the third of the four, according to the way they normally reckon. The first exile is the Babylonian exile. They're actually reckoned in different ways by different Meforshim. But classically, the most conventional reckoning is the Hotsesi. I'm sorry, the four exiles are the Babylonian exile, who destroyed the first temple, the Persian exile, who within a couple of generations defeated the Babylonians and continued to oppress the Jewish people. But it was the Persians also who decided to allow the temple to be rebuilt. So that's Veitzalti. The third exile is the Greek exile, which was to a great extent an internal exile. It was within the 420 years of the Second Temple. Much of that time, the Jews were in an internal exile. They were not driven from their land, but their land was invaded, and the Jewish or the Judean commonwealth was actually like a colony of the Greek Empire. Of course, that's the Hanukkah story, where for a certain period of time, the Greeks were driven from the land of Israel, and things were better for a while, but the good times did not last, because within a couple of generations, the Romans had overwhelmed the Greeks, and then it was the Romans who essentially ruled the land of Israel, and I'm sure who destroyed the Second Temple. And of course, as we know, according to this reckoning, we are still within that exile, the fourth exile, known as Galus Edom, or Galus Romi, meaning Rome. What's the relevance here? So haTurim says the four expressions of redemption correspond to the four exiles. That is to say, Hashem redeemed us from Egypt, which was like a precursor to the four exiles. And in a similar way, one by one, Hashem will redeem us from those other exiles as well. But of course, we are now still within the onerous exile of Edom. And even though I say onerous, in our own lifetimes, things have been not that bad, actually quite good, better than probably at many, many other times in Jewish history. But if we look at the past 2,000 years on the whole, we see a sorry tale of terrible persecution. I don't need to revisit that now, and also dispersal, which the Jews have been dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, and of course, well beyond. And even though Rome is now a relic of ancient history, but the legacy of Rome, in the sense that the Jewish people remain scattered, and the redemption has not yet come to pass, that situation still endures. All of this by way of intro. Says about haTurim, if we look at those expressions, V'otseisi, I will take out. V'itzalti, I will save. V'ga'alti, I will redeem. V'lakachti, I will take. V'otseisi, I will bring out. V'lakachti. So says the haTurim, V'lakachti corresponds to the fourth of the exiles, which is Galus Edom. And he says that V'lakachti implies that it requires strength, it requires power, it requires superior strength in order to extricate the Jewish people from the fourth exile. The fourth exile, as I said a moment ago, is the most onerous, is the most difficult, it's the most challenging. Again, in our lifetimes, things have been not that bad at all, possibly a bit more menacing the last year or two, but we are fortunate to live in peace and prosperity to a very great extent. But of course, the 20th century possibly represented the lowest point of the long and bitter exile. I'm talking, of course, about the Holocaust, and therefore, volakachti, to extricate the Jewish people from that exile, is the most difficult one of all. To me, this has echoes of the hostages in Gaza as well. You know, the Chatufim, the hostages who have been imprisoned in captivity in Gaza through the Hamasnikim, through the people of Hamas. Yes, some have been released, have been freed. As you know, there are 33 who are supposed to be freed in the coming weeks, of whom 3 so far have been released. And of course, what a high price we're paying. I don't want to wade into the politics of it, but just to remind us all of what I'm sure we are aware, that thousands of terrorists, many with blood on their hands, are set to be released. Some have already been released as a result. This is a very high price, and therefore I think it corresponds to velakachti. In order to get back 3 innocent young women, Israel has had to release these many hundreds, close to 2,000 of the terrorists who have been incarcerated for their crimes. Uh, I remember hearing some months ago, earlier on in the crisis, a little clip from a man known as Yoeli. Yoeli, he is a Satmar Chassid and he's a comedian. And he was giving the news according to Yoeli, and he said, "Bring them home." But then he said, "Ubasa shikte mehem." Better than bringing them home, better yet is send them home. I think he was alluding to this. To bring them home is through external intervention, which has proven, of course, unsurprisingly, to be the only way. Shik them mehem, send them home. Halavai Hamas should decide, actually, all of this villainy is not the right path. We're going to release them and send them to freedom. Well, of course, we know that hasn't happened, is not likely to happen. And on the contrary, as haTurim says, velakachti, the last geula is the most difficult, requires great strength, or the demonstration of divine strength, or other forms of strength which derive ultimately from the divine blessing and the capacity that Israel has as a strong country to ultimately succeed in this terrible war. Okay, I don't want to say more about that because this is not the right forum or the arena for considering that aspect of contemporary Jewish life. What I want to share with you is I think, a keen insight into human nature, which is hinted to by haTurim in the beginning of the 7th Aliyah. You can find it if you've got the stone Chumash. It's on page 336. And whichever Chumash you have, it's Perek Tes, chapter 9, verse 17. Perek Tes, Pasuk Yud Zayin. Says the haTurim. Let's take a look at the pasuk first. So Moshe is speaking to Paro, and he says, he's speaking in the name of Hashem, actually, to Paro. Odcha mistolel ba'ami livilti shalcham. If you will continue to tread on my nation, to refuse to send them out, hineni mamtir keis machar barad kaved ma'od. I'm going to cause a exceedingly intense hailstorm to overwhelm your country. But what interests us for now is just the first words, Orcha mistolel ba'ami levilti. For the purpose of this remez, we don't need the last word, although you need the last word in order to make sense of the pasuk, levilti shalcham, and to refuse to send them. But the remez that haTurim points out derives from the first 4 words, Otcha mistolel ba'ami levilti. What's the Rosh Tevos? So you've got Ayin Mem Beis Lamed. If you change the order into an anagram, so we have the name of one of the famous, or might say infamous, personalities in the Torah, Bil'am. Bilam is the one who was hired to curse the Jewish people, which he desperately wanted to do. He wasn't quite successful in cursing them, although he ultimately did bring about great harm to the Jewish people. Of course, that's all narrated in Parshas Balak, which we'll read in the summer. But there's a midrashic tradition about how Bilam got involved in Mitzrayim. So again, Moshe, or in the name of God, says, Od Chamistelel Bamili Vilti. Here you have the Rosh Tevos Bilam. So Baal HaTurim says that this alludes to the fact that Bilam was one of three counselors of Paro. I say fact. This alludes to the fact according to rabbinic tradition. It doesn't say anything about this in the Torah itself, but the Medrash tells us, it's the Gemara actually, in Sanhedrin, the Gemara says that there were three counselors. Paro, like any potentate, has courtiers. He has advisors, and sometimes he seeks their advice. Maybe sometimes they volunteer their advice. According to the Gemara, according to the rabbinic tradition, Paro had three advisors: Bilam, Yisro, and Eov. Let me change the order. Bilam, Eov, and Yisro. These are three quite well-known biblical personalities. Of course, Eov, there's a whole book about him, the book of Job. Yisro, we know, is the father-in-law of Moshe. We've met him already. We'll meet him later on as well. And we've got Bilam. Bilam's character and his prophetic output is described in detail, as I said, in Parshas Balak. But according to Chazal, these three, let's call them wise men, were the counselors of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was perplexed, or was troubled about the growth of the Jewish people, of the Jewish tribe. And he said, let's deal wisely or shrewdly with them, because they're becoming so numerous and they are appearing in all places where we don't really welcome them. Maybe we don't want them. And possibly they will be fifth columnists in a time of war. They'll join our enemies and they will drive us from the land, or they will themselves leave the land. So this is how the book of Shmos begins, as we know. After enumerating the names, and a new king arose who did not know Yosef. And then right away we have the plan of Paro. So Paro's plan was to, which he carried out, was to enslave them, was to persecute them, ultimately to completely dominate them and to exploit them and even to torment them and even to try to kill them all. That's what Paro did. How did Paro come up with such a nefarious plan? And let's say, whose counsel did he follow? So let me tell you what the Gemara says about those three. The idea, the suggestion of enslaving the Jews and ultimately trying to destroy them entirely came from Bilam. Yisro was silent. Yisro didn't speak up on that occasion. And because he was silent, he was, the Gemara says, Bilam advised Paro, yes, go ahead, do it. That's the way, exploit them, take advantage of them, enslave them, embitter their lives. So Bilam was killed, ultimately, as the Torah describes. He was killed by the sword. Okay, it was quite some time later, but even so, he died an early and a violent death. Eov said nothing, and as a result, he was subjected to suffering. And even though the book of Job ends that he was restored to his position of wealth and prominence and health and family, but a lot of suffering enveloped him along the way. That's the whole book of Job. Yisro, so what did he do? Bilam said, yeah, go for it, Paro, exploit them, enslave them. Yisro, Eov reserved judgment, or perhaps he didn't reserve judgment, but he kept quiet. He didn't say anything, did not speak up. And Yisro fled. Because he fled, so he ended up in Midian. That's how he became a priest, etc. And as a kind of reward for the fact that he did not share any liability, any complicity in the persecution of the Jewish people, he became the father-in-law of the Redeemer of Israel, of Moshe Rabbeinu, and according to a separate statement in Chazal, his descendants became members of the Sanhedrin. We mentioned this in the past as well. The irony that the descendants of Yisro were members of the Sanhedrin. The irony is that the descendants of Moshe actually did not achieve that kind of eminence at all, ironically. So far, we've reviewed what the Gemara says, this Midrashic tradition, and the fact that Bilam is hinted to in the words Od Chamistolel Ba'ami. I want to tell you my thoughts about this. Why is it that Eov didn't speak up? According to the testimony of the book of Job itself, he was a righteous person. And he was only subjected to all of that suffering because the Satan, so to speak, persuaded God to put him to the test. Eov was a righteous person. Yisro also, he gave up idolatry, and Yisro was a righteous person. He's the first Jew by choice, as we say nowadays. Bilam, we know, is a villain. Why didn't Eov speak up? I mean, it's difficult to say that even though he was righteous and he feared God, he was charitable and he had all fine qualities, but he wasn't sure about the validity or the morality of Paro's idea, or maybe it was Bilam's idea, and therefore he didn't know what to say, whether it was good or not good, whether to endorse it or whether to protest against him. So he was undecided. Difficult to say that. Yisro, he was righteous and he was rewarded. So why didn't he tell Paro, this is a wretched idea? This is going to end in grief. This is completely immoral to persecute an innocent people, especially those who came as guests of the crown and those who bestowed through Yosef such beneficence upon Egypt. Why didn't he rebuke it? Rebuke Bilam? Why didn't he remonstrate with him? Let Paro be faced with the different suggestions and let him decide. Once he decides, so he carries the can. But if they are advisors, why not speak up? Of course, I think the answer is clear. Eov realized that Paro had already made up his mind. Paro was just looking for validation. He was looking for rubber stamping. Paro did not actually seek the like counsel of different people whose wisdom he respected. Rather, he was just looking for validation of what he already intended to do. That's why Eov realized that to speak up was going to be futile. So therefore, he was silent. But he should not have maybe through his silence given implied consent, and therefore he was subjected to suffering as a result. Why didn't Yisro remonstrate? Because Yisro realized it was futile. He realized that he would possibly be demoted or incarcerated or worse, and therefore Yisro realized the best he could do is to flee and to resign his commission, which he did. I'd like to suggest that this is hinted to in these words in the Torah. Orcha mistolel ba'ami. The word mistolel is a somewhat unusual word. Mistolel. It seems that the Targum says, what Rashi says, the word mistolel is related to the word misila, like misilas yisharim. A misila is a path, or even like a paved path. Derech maslol habarzel is the classic Hebrew word before they came up with the word rakevet. That was, I think, Ben Yehuda's idea, or at least he went with it. But if you look in Mishnah and other sources, you have 19th century rabbinic sources. They call the train maslol habarzel, the path of the iron, like road, so to speak. The word misila refers to a paved path, like derech silula, the path which is paved, which is easy, which is natural. That is to say, there's little resistance. The least resistance path is the one that's the maslol. You don't have to tramp through the mountainside or the countryside or something like that. It's a maslol. It's derech silula. That's the meaning of mistolel. The ArtScroll people translated will you continue to tread? You still tread upon my people to walk upon them. I think that Bilam does not necessarily represent an actual consultant with whom Paro sought to review his plans or consider his options. And the three of them, also Eov and also Yisro, represent the possibilities that are in a person's own mind. A person is confronted with a challenge and he thinks, what shall I do? What's the right path? It was clear that the path, the easy path, the natural path, the derech silula for Paro was to exploit the Jews, to persecute them, to seize their property, to enslave them. And that was the path that was most appealing to Paro, and therefore the other possibilities did not even get a chance to so to speak, advance their alternative suggestions. These consultants were in the mind of Paro. Otcha mistolel ba'ami. Bilam is hinted to there because Bilam is the voice of the Yetzer Hara within Paro. And I can imagine, even though it says whoever is greater than his friend, his Yetzer Hara is greater, but I would imagine Paro had quite a formidable Yetzer Hara as well. So for Paro, the clear path, the inviting path, the natural path was the path of immorality, of exploitation, of harming the Jewish people, even to the point of attempted genocide. That represents the impulse of Bilam. The other possibilities, the other voices, maybe the voice that said, hold on, maybe give it a few more years, maybe give it a generation or two, put it on hold, let's see what other possibilities may emerge. Perhaps that is the voice of Eov, who just basically says, hang tight. Maybe the voice of Yisro was to rebuke Paro and to say, what do you mean? I'm your Yetzer Tov. Don't even think of doing such a thing. Think of how you can assist the Jewish people. Think of how you can advance them. Think of how you can further work with them to derive benefit from their teachings. But that's the voice of the Yetzer Tov, which in the case of Paro, hardly can open his mouth. He's got to flee for his life. So that's what I'd like to suggest. So the remez of Bilam, which haTurim says, he's the one who is in the, original advisory board, the advisory panel, and it was he who advised Paro to persecute and enslave the Jewish people. I would like to suggest there's maybe more to it as well. This idea, this word mistolel means to tread upon them. For Paro, that was the derech silula. That was the inviting natural path, the path of villainy, the path of exploiting an innocent people, and ultimately it led to the downfall of Mitzrayim. Although it has to be acknowledged, this was all part of the divine plan that had been foretold at the time of the Bris Ben Abasarim. And with that, we'll end. And I'll just say that if you'd like to join us on Shabbos for the Dvar Torah after Kiddush, the subject is crime and punishment, a biblical look at villainy. So we'll consider whether Paro and the Mitzrim were really deserving of the punishment they got. After all, Hashem had foretold these events a long time before, that the descendants of Avram will be enslaved in a foreign land. Anyway, that's a subject for another time, for Shabbos at Dvar Torah. Wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and hopefully we'll get together next time. We'll learn more.